China releases new photos and videos captured by its Mars probe, the country's first landing and roving exploration on the Red Planet. China's National Space Administration has released new photos and videos captured by its Mars probe during the country's first landing and roving exploration on the Red Planet. The footage also includes sequences from Zhurong's landing in May, showing the deployment of its parachute system and the moment of touchdown. To find out more about China's Mars mission, I've been speaking to Keith Cowing, a former NASA employee who's now editor of the NASA Watch website.
Cool pictures from another planet are always welcome in my house. The interesting thing about this is that this is the first time China has landed something on Mars, and yet they've pretty much done everything that the U.S. has done on a whole series of missions. So the intriguing thing to me is just how perfectly they did this the first time.
What's most impressive?
Oh, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. But if I were working on this mission, being able to see the parachute deploy as it did, and then being able to see the rover do its thing on the surface, is from an engineering point of view, is very useful. But it really does help explain to a very large audience just exactly what they have accomplished and what is going on Mars.
How would you sum up differences between the Chinese and the American approach, and the Russians, I suppose?
Well, there's several ways to land things on Mars. What they did is they have a relatively large, but not a super large rover. We have one the size of an Austin Mini. They have one that's the size of a golf cart. And they landed it with parachutes and rockets. Whereas we, since we have these monstrous rovers now, have a sky crane that comes in and drops the rover down on a hoist and then lets it go. Prior to this, our rovers, which were about the size of China's, we launched inside of a big beach ball, which bounced and then deflated. So what they've done is sort of taken a technology that we used back in the 70s with some things that we're using here in the 21st century. So there's more than one way to land on Mars. You have to decide, how big your rocket is, how big your rover is going to be, where your risks are, what you know how to do, and what you've never done before. And for China, it all works splendidly.
So it sounds fascinating for each side to watch what the other side is doing and how. Constant process of lessons being learned.
Yes. And of course, the issue does come up eventually, is there a race to Mars? Well, when you have a race, you have to have at least one of the people involved thinking there's a race. And if the other person doesn't act like there's a race, then there probably isn't a race. I think in reality, what you've got here is the increased interest in Mars and the fact that it's not just the U.S. and Russia that have the ability. It's now the U.S. and Russia and China and India and Japan and Europe and other countries that get to go. So, out of chaos comes confusion, and sometimes out of competition, you get more collaboration. And when you have more than one nation involved in doing these things, even if one mission fails, there's another one there to pick up the slack. So there's a beauty in terms of redundancy in having a lot of people doing this. But at the end of the day, I think everybody wants their country to, be number one, but they also want to be participating with everybody else.
And what's the next dramatic development, do you think? I mean, we're watching the landers on Mars. That in itself, brilliant, amazing to see. Is it, I suppose, it might be bringing the evidence back home?
Well, that's the thing is, it's one thing to go there and drive around, take pictures, sample it and so forth. The other is the holy grail of Mars sample return. Now, the current plan for America and Europe is it gets complicated, I'll warn you. Our current rover, Perseverance, will grab a bunch of samples and leave them somewhere. Then a European lander will come down with a rover that drives really fast. They'll grab those samples and launch them on a little rock into orbit around Mars. Then another spacecraft will catch it and bring it back to Earth. And that'll happen in 7 or 8 years. China has shown a methodical approach to things on the moon, where they start with a little lander, then a bigger one, and a bigger one, and then they bring a sample back. I would not be surprised. I don't have any evidence for this, but I would not be surprised if the next mission that China sends to Mars would attempt to do a sample return, and they might even do it before we do.
Very, very briefly, can you see a future in which the US and China would actually collaborate in space?
They do, they have, and unfortunately right now there's, you could have, the new space station that China's putting up. It is designed such that American and Russian spacecraft could dock with it, and Chinese spacecraft can dock with the International Space Station. So it's not rocket science, it's politics. And the one thing I remind people of is that although, if you look at the US and Russia right now, we're kind of arguing about things on Earth. And yet, if you look at the International Space Station, with other than a few minor blips here and there for 20 years, not only the US and Russia, but Japan and Canada and Europe and Brazil, a whole bunch of countries have gotten along remarkably well. So you got to ask yourself, what is it that we're doing in space that we're getting right in terms of cooperation and collaboration that maybe it can teach us how to do a few things back on Earth? And also, every time we threaten sanctions and so forth, the space station seems to not be part of the discussion. So again, not having China in that mix, I think we're missing something, but we're not there yet. There's some other discussions amongst the politicians that have to happen first.
I love that story.